Our breaking news on DC News Now at 10. Former DC drug kingpin Rayful Edmond has died. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Chris Flanagan.
And I'm Susan Tran. Edmonds was 60 years old and just released from prison months ago. He was sentenced to life for introducing and then fueling the crack epidemic in DC in the 80s. Prosecutors say he ran a sophisticated enterprise that moved massive amounts of cocaine that had a street value of $15 million.
In July, he was transferred from prison to a halfway house down in Florida. His former attorney posting this message to social media tonight, saying he just talked to Edmond yesterday and that he is floored by the news.
The feds say that Edmond controlled as much as 30% of DC's cocaine market, and his drug ring was linked to 30 homicides.
Washington, D.C.'s king of crack will be released from prison. At the age of 24, Rayful Edmonds was looking at spending the rest of his life in a federal prison somewhere. Concrete and steel, loneliness, depression. It was all in his future. After all, he was the king of crack in Washington, D.C. Prosecutors said that Edmonds' organization employed over 150 people, and in the wake of his crack sales, that organization committed at least 30 murders. If you knew Rayful outside of the dirty part of drug dealing, many people said you would find him to be a likable guy, good looking, with a good personality. Most people around him never knew that he was running a crack empire that was destroying the Chocolate City. You see, Rayful loved basketball, and he enjoyed playing the game. He would sit courtside at Georgetown Hoya games and struck up friendships with basketball great Alonzo Mourning and other basketball stars, John Turner. John Thompson, the coach, had gotten word that Rayful was the king of crack and sent word that he wanted to talk to him. In no uncertain terms, the coach told Rayful to fall back from hanging out with his players. He threatened that if Rayful did not do so, there would be serious consequences, according to some. Rayful fell back, but his world would soon come crashing down on him, like the Great Walls of Jericho. On April 15, 1989, he would be arrested and charged by the feds. There was a long list of violations continuing a criminal enterprise, conspiracy to distribute cocaine and crack. Things were not looking good for Rayful. The government alleged in court documents that Edmonds, along with Dwayne D.C. Scorpio, was said to have brought between 1,000 to 2,000 kilos of cocaine per week in 1992 from the Trujillo Blanco brothers, who were associated with the Medellin cartel, and sold the drugs to Washington area wholesalers. Edmonds' estimated revenue was approximately $300 million annually. He was known to have spent $457,619 in an exclusive Georgetown store, Linné Petit, specializing in Italian men's clothing, owned by Charles Wynn, who was later convicted on 34 counts of money laundering. A trial ensued, and Rayful found himself on the losing end. On September 17, 1990, the district court imposed sentences of mandatory life without parole on count 1, life without parole on counts 2 and 5, 60 months on count 11, and 48 months on count 14, 15, 16, and 18. Edmonds' sentences were to run concurrently. At 24 years old, Rayful's young life would be stamped out in a federal courthouse. The Chocolate City was burying their biggest drug dealer alive. This was it. Or was it? Rayful was not the only one to feel the trauma. The feds also sentenced his mother, Constance Bootsy Perry, to 14 years in prison for being part of the enterprise. Rayful would later win 2 separate appeals, but the sentence of life would always remain intact. Or would it? With a life sentence, what would Rayful do? He would go on to sell drugs from prison. Of course, even the penitentiary could not stop him from doing what he wanted to do. Life as he knew it was over, so why not keep getting money? While in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, he became the man. He would hook up with Dixon Dario and Osvaldo Chiqui Trujillo Blanco, son of Griselda Godmother Trujillo Blanco, who shared the same cell block with him. Edmonds was setting up deals between D.C. area traffickers and his Colombian connection while incarcerated. In 1996, Edmond and another drug dealer from Atlanta named Lowe were convicted after conducting drug business from a federal prison phone. Edmond received an additional 30-year sentence in the great state of Pennsylvania. In an interview with the Bureau of Prisons, Edmond said he had spent several hours every day on the telephone, occasionally using 2 lines simultaneously to conduct his drug business. Attorney General Eric Holder criticized the Federal Bureau of Prisons for its lax management that allowed drug dealers to deal drugs from inside the prison. With life plus 30 years, Rafel said he wanted out, and there was only one way to make that happen. He had to work for the feds. And in 1996, federal authorities had revealed that Edmond had become a government informant. This was in the making long before the drug dealing in Lewisburg, though. You see, in 1994, law enforcement officials approached Mr. Edmond about cooperating with the government, and he orally agreed to do so. Mr. Edmond executed a written agreement to cooperate in early 1995 with the former United States Attorney and former Attorney General, Eric Holder, the same man who criticized the Bureau of Prisons. Mr. Edmond agreed to offer substantial assistance while incarcerated at USP Lewisburg, a maximum security institution with inmates who were among the most dangerous recidivists in the nation at the time. A federal prison that was rife with violence and murder. A bold move for him, because had the DC car found out this information, he would have been killed. And despite imminent danger, Mr. Edmond agreed to cooperate. This cooperation was supposed to only benefit his mother. According to court documents, Mr. Edmond acknowledged that his substantial assistance would not result in the filing of a Rule 35B motion on his behalf. In other words, Mr. Edmond's cooperation solely benefited Miss Perry, his mother, as the third-party beneficiary of the plea agreement. And Miss Perry would receive a sentence reduction based on Mr. Edmond's substantial assistance, as prescribed in the government's Rule 35B motion in Miss Perry's case. Her original sentence of 293 months and her 24.42 years was reduced to 14 years based on resentencing hearings for legal mistakes. Rafel's mom was originally sentenced to 24 years. Could you imagine your mother going down for 24 years for the crimes that you committed? Would you involve your mom in your cocaine and crack conspiracy? Some people do. But based on Rafel's cooperation, Judge Penn would on June 2nd, 1998, resentence Miss Perry to time served. You see, Rafel wanted to save his mother, as she had had enough of prison. This is what he wanted to do. He wanted Mama to go home. Rafel had freed his mother. Everybody was fair game, and Rafel would help with 20 homicides that law enforcement wanted to solve. 20 homicides. But would he ever be released? He already had 3 separate first-degree murder charges dismissed. Now what did he have to do? He had to find a way out. You see, Rafel was playing a dirty game that could have cost him his life. He was selling drugs from the penitentiary, all while working for the government. He agreed to work with the government in a covert drug investigation commencing in August 1994. Next, Mr. Edmond testified as a government witness in 2 criminal trials in the Middle District of Pennsylvania. In the first trial, his testimony contributed to at least 2 of his fellow inmates, Freddie Aguilera and Nelson Garcia, being convicted and sentenced to life in prison for agreeing to ship cocaine from Colombia to Mr. Edmond's associates in the district. And 2, in the second trial, his testimony over the course of 8 days led to the convictions of 2 individuals, Michael A. Jackson, not the singer, and James Marshall Corbin. If Rafel wanted his freedom someday, the government wanted more. They wanted blood. Mr. Edmond would then participate in the reverse undercover sting of DC drug dealers who had been the recipients of cocaine shipped at his behest to them in 1992 from the Trujillo Blanco Colombian cartel family. In August 1996, Mr. Edmond invited those targets to purchase cocaine from a shipment that would be delivered to the district, and the undercover operation led to the seizure of $190,000 in drug proceeds. From the penitentiary, he was directing and working. In April 1997, Judge Thomas F. Hogan accepted Mr. Edmond's testimony that resolved the dispute regarding the 1992 drug conduct of 2 co-conspirators, and his testimony was corroborated by wiretap evidence. In the end, the undercover operation led to the convictions of 8 defendants: Rodney Murphy, Jimmy Robinson, LeCount Jackson, Adolph Jackson, Darrell Coles, Marcus Haynes, Johnny Cherry, and Christopher Johnson. Still, the government had not gotten enough. They had not gotten enough. They wanted more, and more was to come. Mr. Edmond provided the field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with information regarding 2 homicides that were committed at USP Lewisburg in 1994. And Mr. Edmond was expected to testify as a government witness at the trials for both homicides. Also, the government indicated that Mr. Edmond was willing to provide testimony in the fall of 1997 with the approval of the Deputy Attorney General of the United States to various congressional oversight committees that were investigating issues involving drug trafficking and prison reform. In this new motion to finally collect on his cooperation, the government summarized Mr. Edmonds' cooperation as follows. Mr. Edmonds' assistance to law enforcement is proven to be very substantial and has directly led to numerous convictions of major national and international drug traffickers. In addition, Mr. Edmond has provided law enforcement with information that may help the Bureau of Prisons reconsider policies regarding privileges granted to maximum security federal inmates that are inconsistent with the Bureau of Prisons' mission to incapacitate certain prisoners. Finally, Mr. Edmonds' cooperation in the attendant publicity may have helped rectify serious social problems in D.C. by demoralizing other drug dealers. His cooperation has also helped to dispel his legendary image among the drug culture and now serves to discourage others from imitating his conduct as a drug kingpin. Here, Rayful wanted to make sure that certain privileges are limited for those in maximum security prisons. Did he want to contribute to the suffering of maximum security prisoners? You decide. Rayful's agreement called for him in 2002 to testify as a government witness for approximately 4 days in the trial of 6 defendants. In United States versus Kevin Gray. Prior to his arrest in 1989, Mr. Edmond had conducted drug transactions with many of the defendants in that case, according to his testimony. As noted by the government, the Gray racketeering drug enterprise covered criminal activity spanning more than a decade and was perhaps the most violent drug trafficking group ever prosecuted in this district. According to prosecutors, Kevin Gray and his crew were responsible for over 30 homicides in the D.C. area. Mr. Edmonds' testimony led to the convictions of all 6 defendants for RICO conspiracy and related charges in connection with multiple first-degree murders and drug offenses. In 2003, Mr. Edmond testified as a government witness in a trial concerning drug trafficking in the Western District of North Carolina. In addition, Mr. Edmond was prepared to testify in a second case in this district, but the case was resolved via guilty plea, in part due to Mr. Edmond's cooperation. Mr. Edmond has supplied background and associational information that has been used in drug trafficking investigations. In particular, his information has been used in numerous wiretap investigations. Noting that Mr. Edmonds' information was not the sole basis for their wiretaps in any of these investigations, but very useful. The government asserts that based in part on Mr. Edmonds' assistance in this regard, over 100 drug dealers were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. The government avers that the information from Mr. Edmond and others was used to obtain wiretaps in narcotic investigations in 12 different matters. In the first matter, the wiretap led to 39 indictments involving 65 defendants. The wiretap in the second matter led to 5 indictments involving 14 defendants. In the third matter, the wiretap led to 1 indictment involving 22 defendants. The wiretap in the fourth matter led to 1 indictment involving 14 defendants. In the fifth matter, the wiretap led to 3 indictments involving 77 defendants. The wiretap in the sixth matter led to 15 indictments involving 29 defendants. In the seventh matter, the wiretap led to 4 indictments involving 36 defendants. The wiretap in the 8th matter led to 5 indictments involving 5 defendants. And there were many, many more. Many, many, many more. Mr. Edmond has provided information to local law enforcement investigating cold case homicides, Judge, including a significant amount of information concerning relevant relationships. Mr. Edmond participated in monthly telephone calls with the AUSA John Dominguez, who relayed questions from law enforcement which allowed them to collect information about relationships between the descendants and suspects not otherwise known to the investigators. Mr. Edmond has often been able to provide information to investigators regarding friendships, rivalries, or feuds among descendants and suspects. Mr. Edmond's information assisted law enforcement with focusing its attention on others, once learning that a suspect had a motive to commit murder, even when those murders occur after the defendant has been incarcerated. You know, Judge, in moving for this reduction of sentence, the government notes that none of Mr. Edmond's information about cold cases led directly to arrests, but the information helped homicide detectives focus limited resources by relating historical information about which drug dealer was allied with whom and which dealer was arguing with another dealer. Mr. Edmonds' information contributed to the local cold case squad, solving old homicides in the District of Columbia. On February 23, 2021, Judge Emmett Sullivan, a D.C. native, appointed by none other than President George H.W. Bush, decided that Rayful should not die in prison. The government, 30 years after Rayful's conviction, filed a motion asking the court to reduce the sentence under what is called a Rule 35 motion for substantial assistance. The judge ordered a hearing, and the United States attorney would testify on behalf of Rayful, telling the judge that despite the bodies that were left in the streets of D.C. and the crack that played in the city's downfall, he was a changed man. A changed man that deserved a second chance to reclaim his life. Despite saying that Rayful was a changed man, the government wanted the court to impose a 40-year term. Rayful was dealing with the devil, but it's always that way when you want your freedom. When the government was looking for a life sentence, they would tell the court, between 1985, Judge, and 1989, Mr. Edmond led a large-scale cocaine distribution conspiracy. Mr. Edmond's operation generated millions of dollars from the wholesale and retail distribution of cocaine and crack cocaine. This court should know that Mr. Edmond and his associates were unscrupulous in their pursuit of cold cash and their collection of valuable items, including expensive cars, $1,000 shirts, gold medallions worth $60,000, diamond-encrusted Rolex watches, swimming pools, hundreds of tennis shoes, and wads of $100 bills. You see, Judge, this defendant should die in prison. And the government painted the picture that Rayful was the worst of the worst that society had within it. And the court would then impose that life sentence. But the government's position would later change when he agreed to help the government. Rayful would argue that the 40 years that the government was asking for was far too much time. He had to sit at the table and wonder, these were my friends, and now they want 40 years. I thought they were going to release me. Rayful would ask the judge for 15 years. He would cite his substantial assistance and the need to avoid unwarranted sentencing disparities. Then the judge, in response, would say, what troubles the court deeply, however, is that Mr. Edmond stands convicted of having run the largest cocaine distribution operation in the history of the nation's capital. Although there are no statutorily defined victims in this case, it is beyond dispute that Mr. Edmond's involvement in the criminal enterprise damaged this community deeply and resulted in the destruction of the lives of many individuals. While this might be shocking to the average citizen, the judge said, in reducing Mr. Edmond's case and reducing his sentence, that no matter how horrible an offender's crimes, how unlikely his prospect of rehabilitation, how dangerous he might be, an informer deserves a reward for the benefit conferred on society by his assistance in investigating and prosecuting wrongdoers. He even quoted a case from the Southern District of New York that was issued in December 6, 2006, United States versus Torres Tire. To reward Mr. Edmond for his cooperation, the government moved to reduce his sentence in this case. When the dust settled, Judge Emmett G. Sullivan did not hand down the 40-year sentence that the government wanted for the changed and reformed man. Instead, Judge Sullivan reduced the sentence to 20 years. In July 2024, Rayful Edmonds, after serving 34 years in federal prison, would finally find freedom. According to the BOP, he was released to Nashville, Tennessee at the halfway house. But that wouldn't last long. He would relocate to Florida, and video would surface of him telling the world he's free, feeling better than ever, and back at it. On December 17, 2024, Rayful would take his last breath, but he wouldn't leave this world the way that some people thought he would. Some people thought that he would lose his life in the streets, similar to Elbow, but not Rayful. According to court papers and documents from the BOP and his lawyer, Rayful died of a heart attack. At 60 years old, after serving 34 years of his life in prison,